Today I speak with Professor Bruce Hoffman, a Wilson Center alum and professor at Georgetown University, as well as senior fellow for terrorism and homeland security at the Council on Foreign Relations. On day 12, since the unprecedented and shocking Hamas attacks on Israel and the ensuing war in Gaza, more than 1,400 Israelis are killed. And in Gaza, more than 4,000 Palestinians. Hamas yesterday confirmed it has more than 200 hostages and said it will be willing to immediately release the civilian hostages, both foreign and Israeli, if Israel stops its airstrikes on Gaza. The tragic killing of hundreds of Palestinians at the Mamadani hospital in Gaza yesterday triggered outrage and protests across the Arab world, from Ramallah to Amman to Beirut to Tunis and elsewhere. An inflection point in this conflict, as many have noted. And President Biden is in Israel today, has reiterated his support for Israel and the people of Israel. But fears of escalation continue to rise as this conflict intensifies. Professor Hoffman, what is your current assessment of what is going on? Does October 7th change the calculus in the region? But most importantly, how the US is engaged in the region at a time when, particularly with the Biden administration, the goal was to sort of keep the status quo as is before October 7th.
Certainly the October 7th attacks, I think, have upended peace processes in the Middle East because the United States had actually re-engaged in the region, was attempting to broker an historic landmark Saudi Arabian Israeli recognition deal that would have also resulted in a Saudi-US defense pact, which would have been equally historical, and of course would have isolated Iran. So we can see that, at least in the background, Iran had a huge stake or a huge interest in seeing progress towards peace in the Middle East, and especially the Palestinian-Israeli conflict upended. Hamas, by the same token, did as well. I've written for decades that the biggest enemies, or the most important enemies of terrorists everywhere, are not their hardline opponents, but rather moderates and those who work for peace. And we can see that in previous junctures too, on all sides. Individuals opposed to peace have resorted to violence to scuttle processes that were nearing fruition, and that they had more to fear from than war and violence itself.
So you mentioned Hamas, designated, of course, as you mentioned, as a terrorist organization in the United States and in Europe. For many of the regional leaders, the Arab leaders, there's no love lost with Hamas. But of course, a lot of the statements that came out were very focused on de-escalation, the immediate statements, that is, and since then, calls on Israel to stop the bombardment of Gaza. How do you see things shifting between the United States, Israel, and America's key partners on all of these different issues? For many of them, they want to see Hamas debilitated and the Palestinian Authority strengthened. But this is also happening at the expense of the Palestinian people, with the vast majority of those killed being civilians in Gaza, adding more pressures on their countries.
I think a very sad development in warfare, especially in the 21st century, is that the overwhelming number of casualties are not combatants, but innocent people, civilians whose lives are upended, who become pawns in these terrible struggles and terrible tragedies. It's true that there have been thousands of Palestinian casualties now from the bombings. It's interesting to me that 12 days into this crisis, the Israel Defense Forces still haven't launched their ground operations. I mean, that's enormously significant. Basically, within days of the October 7th attack, IDF reservists had been mobilized, now a larger number that were even mobilized 50 years ago in the Yom Kippur War. Also, maybe actually about the same, I should say, maybe not more. In fact, I think 400,000 were mobilized in Yom Kippur and 360,000. So I misspoke. But the point is, Israel, as other countries, would go in immediately as part of a desire for vengeance, as part of a bloodlust. It's fascinating that the IDF has been holding back. So hopefully that is a sign of some moderation and some caution. But the problem with calls for ceasefires or for negotiations is, how do you negotiate with or declare a ceasefire with an entity that has stated on innumerable occasions that their goal is annihilation, that Hamas does not want negotiation or cooperation, not just with Israel, but even with other regimes that it opposes. So this, I think, is the difficult position that Israel finds itself in now, that the attacks on October 7th, I would say, are a game changer in just the nature of terrorism. That terrorism has changed forever, much like it had changed, for instance, with the 9/11 attacks and the response that resulted in, and much as it changed with the advent of ISIS. The fact that Hamas was able to mount coordinated, simultaneous attacks on air, sea, and land is really without precedent historically. So in that sense, Israel has really no alternative but to weaken and degrade Hamas's military capabilities. But the undeniable challenge is encountering an enemy that deliberately embeds itself within the surrounding civilian population. Again, this isn't a new problem. The United States military encountered this in Iraq, for example, especially in the battles of Fallujah in 2004 and 2005. And that's why armies throughout the world would always prefer not to fight in heavily populated, built-up urban environments, such as they will face in Gaza City.
So you mentioned that the IDF has been restrained in going in right away with the ground invasion, even though the preparations, of course, have been called in from day one. Many leaders in the region are very worried about a ground invasion because this also may invite other actors, particularly on the Israel's northern border, and primarily Hezbollah. Do you think that this is also as a result of U.S. diplomacy in the region, given that Tony Blinken has been in the region for over a week?
That Hezbollah hasn't intervened. Is that
right? That we haven't seen a ground invasion, given that may invite Hezbollah or pull it into the conflict.
Yes, I mean, I think that's certainly possible. I think, frankly, too, that the Israel Defense Forces are putting together targeting packages. And in putting together those packages, they're attempting to be as precise as possible in who and what they target once and if they go into the Gaza Strip. I would say that Hezbollah's restraint is the big question right now. The Deputy Secretary General of that movement just a couple of days ago had said that Hezbollah would not be persuaded or influenced at all by regional calls for restraint, much less from the United States or other countries. I suspect that the United States' positioning of 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in the Eastern Mediterranean is not only to show support for Israel, but also to send a powerful deterrent message to both Hezbollah and to its state patron, Iran, who's also a patron of Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad. So I think there's a very complicated orchestration of diplomatic initiatives going on, designed to dampen, insofar as is humanly possible, the escalation towards war, not just in Gaza itself on the ground, but preventing its spread throughout the region.
And given the interconnectedness of all of these different issues, not only for United States national security interests in the region, but also for U.S. homeland security. And as a terrorism and homeland security expert, I think then you're asking the question of the likelihood that this Hamas-Israel war spilling over to the rest of the world through terrorist attacks or retaliation as that has happened in the past.
An absolute imminent danger. Of that, there's no doubt, because the terrorists have said as much. Since the crisis began 12 days ago, virtually every Salafi jihadi, as well as, which is to say, Sunni terrorist group that embraces a particular interpretation of Islam, as well as Shia militia groups, have issued statements not just of support to Hamas and PIJ, but pledging their own fighters to come to Gaza to engage in combat, promising intervention, promising vengeance. Now, one can dismiss all of this as just the kind of chest thumping or saber rattling that attends many crises, especially when terrorist groups are involved. But the sheer number is very worrisome. And all right, perhaps it is bravado that they're actually going to descend on Gaza to help Hamas and PIJ there. But apart from that, it would be very tempting for them and very logical for them to strike at the targets of those countries that have supported Israel, as well as Israeli targets overseas. But in that respect, we could see not just Israel, but the United States, and then indeed the other countries who a week ago, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy, who also pledged unequivocal support for Israel. So yes, there is a possibility of this becoming part of a global terrorist campaign, if only because terrorists are the consummate opportunists. They're always looking for an opportunity to elbow themselves into the limelight, to focus some of the attention on themselves. And how do terrorists achieve that? By engaging in terrorist attacks. So unfortunately, and I would predict tragically, I think we have to take seriously the prospect that this conflict will spark terrorist attacks in other corners of the world.
And you mentioned how some of the targets will be, of course, some of the European countries that have taken a very strong stance with Israel in the wake of the October 7th attacks. But what about the countries in the region who have recently normalized relations with Israel as well? How does this particular war, the Hamas-Israel war today, impact the Abraham Accords between, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco?
Well, certainly the progress that was being achieved in furthering the Abraham Accords and even bringing other Muslim countries into that agreement. I mean, it's completely on hold, and it's on hold because of the uncertainty of the conflict right now. It's on hold, obviously, because of the suffering of the Palestinian people, of the innocent civilians that are caught in the crossfire of this horrible conflict. The big question is whether progress can be made, and once the conflict ends, and how long after it ends will it be possible to resume these talks and negotiations. And I think a lot of that will depend on what happens in the coming weeks and months, and how this terrible crisis right now is ultimately resolved. And it's, as we've been discussing, so complicated and so complex. I mean, more so, I think, than other conflicts, certainly that we faced in this century. So it becomes very unpredictable to assess that. On top of everything that I've just said, what I'm finding so challenging as an analyst, and arguably perhaps as an expert, is that there's so much bad information out there. I mean, there's so much information that is unmoderated that we're getting that has to be checked even when one hears it on the news or reads it in print. We're all I think it's incumbent upon all of us to go and verify that information and make sure that it's accurate, because at this highly emotional and highly dynamic time, it's very easy to misinterpret information as being actually factual when in fact it has an ulterior motive, just to inflame tensions more, to stir up emotions, to sharpen frictions. So we all have to be even more careful than ever. And that means also realizing that this is going to be the kind of conflict that's very difficult, not just to predict, but in fact to control its outcome.
And as you mentioned, the disinformation and misinformation wars happening online. We have, the onus is on us in the policymaking community, in the think tank community, to verify all this information, but not everybody does that. And that further complicates the divergence of how people are viewing what is happening. Professor Bruce Hoffman, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your expertise.
You're very welcome.